inflation.
Futures up 22 this morning. The heart of Bloomberg surveillance is the quality of our guests, always in every case. And as we spoke to Dr. Yardeni moments ago, we speak now to Jeffrey Sachs. To say he's economic professor at Columbia University barely describes his contribution. I want to make note that he was 10 years out front on the collapse of American education and the struggle of two Americas. But Jeff, I must digress to your take on the war in Ukraine and on the Russia you knew so well under Yeltsin. You're in the Atlantic this week, and they're equating you with Mearsheimer of Chicago as the realist out there. What should be our response to Mr. Putin with your thoughts on war and aggression after the human atrocities that are reported?
Yeah, I was attacked in the Atlantic for being on the side of peace, and I confess I'm on the side of peace. I am very worried that we are on a path of escalation to nuclear war. Nothing less than that. We have essentially a war in which Russia feels that this war is at the core of its security interests. The United States insists that it will do anything to support Ukraine's defeat of Russia. Russia views this as a proxy war with the United States. And whatever one thinks about this, this is a path of extraordinarily dangerous escalation. And I am very fearful.
Right. You lived this with Yeltsin. You were there for Gorbachev and Yeltsin and the rest. I remember when you got off the airplane at JFK, essentially shattered over the collapse of that first experiment. Do you have a feeling that Mr. Putin is alone? Is his military in support of him?
A lot of the world is watching the events in horror, and a lot of the world doesn't like this NATO expansion, which they interpret as at the core of this. They want to see compromise between the U.S. and Russia. In vote after vote in the United Nations, basically it's been the Western countries that have been voting for sanctions and denunciations and other actions, whereas most of the world, certainly most of the world counted by population, is on the sidelines. They just view this as a horrible clash between Russia and the United States. They don't view this as we describe it in the media as an unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine. That's, anyone in the United States, they'd say, well, what else is it? But that's because the way that our media have been reporting this. This conflict goes back a long time. It didn't start on February 24th. 2022 in fact, the war itself started in 2014, not in 2022, and even that had antecedents. And so most of the world doesn't see it the way we describe it, but most of the world's just terrified right now, frankly, because it's unbelievable to be hearing on one side, well, we'll use nuclear weapons if we need to, and the other side saying, you can't frighten us.
Well, and Professor Sachs, I share the concern, and I'll be honest, I spent the weekend also reading articles about the U.S. coming up with counterattacks and proposals of what they would do in response to some of these attacks. It's definitely a big concern. It's also an issue as you see this sea change in the economic trajectory in Europe and beyond. And some of this does come from the energy crisis. But suddenly we're talking about inflation that we have not seen since World War II, since potentially another time of incredible distress and military intervention. How close are we to some sort of, I don't want to say hyperinflation, but persistent inflationary impulse well above target in Germany, in the euro area, as they look to these alternative ways to suppress the peripheral region from getting out of control as they raise rates in the front end?
Well, Europe is in a very, very sharp economic downturn. The sharp decline of output and living standards also shows up as a rise of prices. But the main fact is that the European economy is getting hammered by this, by the sudden cutoff of energy. And now, to make it definitive, the destruction of the Nordstream pipeline, which I would bet was a U.S. action, perhaps U.S. and Poland. This is
Jeff,
speculation.
we got to stop there. That's quite a statement as well. Why do you feel that was a U.S. action? What evidence do you have of that?
Well, first of all, there's direct radar evidence that U.S. Helicopters, military helicopters that are normally based in Gdansk, were circling over this area. We also had the threats from the United States earlier in this year that one way or another, we are going to end Nordstream. We also have a remarkable statement by Secretary Blinken last Friday in a press conference. He says, this is also a tremendous opportunity. It's a strange way to, it's a strange way to talk if you're worried about the piracy on international infrastructure of vital significance. So I know this runs counter to our narrative. It runs, you're not allowed to say these things in the West. But the fact of the matter is, all over the world, when I talk to people, they think the U.S. did it. Just to tell you, and by the way, even reporters on our papers that are involved tell me privately, yeah, well, of course, but it doesn't show up in our media.
Professor, I don't want to get into tit for tat about what did or did not happen with Nord Stream, because I don't have the evidence and we don't have a counterbalance to this. There is an issue, though, that's at the heart of what you're saying, which is a lack of trust in the United States, a lack of cohesion in allies in the midst of incredible political as well as economic strife. I mean, do you see the likelihood of working together at a time when there are such disparate interests and feelings of distrust?
The biggest problem is that we have major geopolitical conflict, not only U.S. and Russia, but also U.S. and China. So, and again, with a tremendous amount of provocation coming from the U.S. side as well. So we're breaking any sense of stability right now. For the moment, many in Europe are saying, well, the U.S. is our closest ally. We need to hold on. But watch what's happening politically. There's upheaval in Europe, country after country right now. We're entering a period of enormous instability, and we're unstable in the United States as well. We went through an insurrection. We're still not past that. So we're entering the most unstable geopolitical era in many decades. We're entering the first hyperinflation in more than 40 years, and we're entering the first escalation to the nuclear precipice in 60 years. 60 years exactly this month was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and this is the most dangerous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's an extraordinary overload, and we see no attempt to tamp this down, to quiet it down. Every day is about escalation. We're going to defeat the other side. We have our rights. We can stand up what we want. We have Speaker Pelosi flying to Taiwan. So many provocations in the midst of huge instability.
Well, Jeffrey, we're going to have to leave it there. Jeff Sachs, thank you so much. Greatly appreciate it. John, we're getting a fiery response from this interview.
Are you surprised?
No, I'm not. And you know, this is what we do with surveillance. There's a different opinion out there. And I would call it small, but there's a considered opinion out there internationally along his line, again, about the expansion of NATO too far, too fast.